Own Backup protects against data loss and corruption by providing enterprise-level control of data across all your Salesforce orgs from a single dashboard. Interactive graphs make it easy to identify Salesforce data changes over time, and automated daily backups protect your Salesforce data, metadata, and attachments. Manage proactively with customizable smart alerts that notify you whenever data is added, changed, or deleted. Quickly search your entire backup archive to find specific records, remove records individually or in bulk, and stay compliant with internal and external regulations, including GDPR. Compare backups at the click of a button to locate the exact point at which data was lost or corrupted, and recover lost data quickly, regardless of scale. With Own Backup, you can restore data records with their corresponding parent-child relationships down to any level of granularity. Speed up development with Own Backup Sandbox Seeding and Replicate to create anonymized test data sets in minutes, while advanced key management and access controls help to keep your data secure. Backup, compare, recover, replicate, and comply with Own Backup for Salesforce.
We were just a bunch of nerdy kids who ignored the haters. We took their ridicule and we built on it. And when some of us gave up, well, we built on that too. Built resilience, built on a mission to make things a little better every day until the users came. Then the haters were VCs who scoffed at our audacity. This just isn't the way things are done. But we kept building. Users turned into teams, turned into companies, running their entire businesses on our apps. Then the software giants came after us. We weren't proven, we weren't fully featured, our radical cloud model wasn't secure. But we built on. And today, as companies adopt the cloud to move faster, teams are finding themselves slowed down by each other's efforts. The skeptics are claiming we'll never develop innovation at scale. But now, DevOps have come to the cloud, ushering in a new era of transformation. Companies can release on demand across hundreds of environments, innovating faster with fewer conflicts and fewer disruptions. There will always be challenges. There will always be naysayers. And we'll build on.
Okay, so let's dive into this. We won't spend too much time on intros, but just a little bit. For those of you who I haven't had the opportunity to meet yet, my name is Susannah St Germain. I'm a Salesforce MVP. I'm also a co-lead of Ladies Be Architects. So I'm here today in that capacity. I'm also in my day job, I'm a technical architect at a company called Oauth. So we're a partner in ISV in the Salesforce community. And I'm also very active on Twitter, so would love to, if you have questions after the session, or if you'd just like to connect, please go ahead and give me a follow on Twitter. That's my handle right there. And let me pass it over to Gemma, and let me see if I can fix this camera. I don't want to cover your...
Follow. As Susannah said, we're all very active on Twitter. It's my pleasure to meet you. My name's Gemma Blizzard, and I'm also a Salesforce MVP. And I'm also, having broken away from the corporate world last year, I'm also the founder of a new type of consultancy, which is a home for Salesforce architects to do their best work. So it's my pleasure to meet you all. We founded Ladies Be Architects in 2017. So we did this because we were three friends with a shared vision. We wanted to empower people around the world, not just of any specific gender identity. We wanted to act as an enabler for Salesforce professionals around the world to become leaders of Salesforce project delivery. So we started really by studying together. We were all three of us working towards the working our way through the architect pyramid, and started to work towards our CTA together as well. And we became friends, and we connected over this shared vision to enable people around the world to do this. Meanwhile, in Australia, we have three fantastic women, Emily, Vicky and Adrienne, who are also working on their path to CTA. alongside us and helping to grow the talent and professionalism of senior delivery consultants out in Australia. So it's not, Ladies Be Architects isn't something that you can join, it's something that you can participate in, and we welcome absolutely everybody to use our resources available on YouTube and on our website, and we would love to tell your stories as well. So if you have a story to share about how you have progressed your career and your knowledge on Salesforce architecture, we'd love to hear you. Come reach out to us. So today we're going to be talking a bit about Identity and Access Manager. We just have, we're not going to teach you any of the hardcore details. We believe that that's been done a lot over the last few years. So we're actually here for all of you who are thinking of studying for this exam, and we just want to give you a little bit of a pep and help you understand really what the concepts are going to be when you tackle this exam. So with that said, Susannah?
Absolutely. Yeah, so, you know, when we started, Gemma and I started talking about the session, we were thinking, well, we'll go through and show you like the click path for these things and all that. And we realized that, well, we realized two things. One, that's been done a million times. There's tons of content and tons of resources out there on how to set stuff up tactically about identity and access. And also we wanted to take a more architectural sort of point of view. It's not just about how to set this thing up, how to set identity and access management tools up. It's how to actually use them and when to use them and the trade-offs involved in making those decisions. So that's what the session is going to be like. But before we get started, I do just want to make sure we're all on the same page and baseline that we're going to have this pretty technical discussion, and we're going to assume that you've all read and understand the RFC 6749 OAuth framework. Just kidding. Actually, I have a funny story. So that's when I first started learning about OAuth and other identity tools, you know, I definitely had some brilliant friends of mine who were like, well, the best place to start is with the spec. And I absolutely agree now that I've sort of brought different pieces of learning and I understand the terms a little bit better. But if you're like me, not from an IT background, if you start with the spec, you can start to read it and be like, what on earth? I'm a terrible architect. Like, I don't understand anything about IT. And you can very quickly start to have a bit of an identity crisis.
Yeah.
So if this has happened to you, if you've been trying to study for this exam or just been trying to understand these topics and you've started to just like get yourself all turned around, believe me, you're not alone. And that's what we're going to be here today talking about, sort of deconstructing why some of these topics are hard and give you some guidance on how to actually use these tools and not get stuck in the alphabet soup.
Mm-hmm. So why is it hard? Well, it's hard for those of us who have been used to the clicks not code mantra and approach of Salesforce, but also because Salesforce Identity is actually a set of tools and they are not specifically tied to Salesforce. They're tied across multiple different platforms. When you want to learn about some of the concepts to do with Salesforce Identity, there are lots of technical terms that are used inconsistently. A token over here might mean a session ID over there, so that it's a lot of the time learning this conceptually and doing an exam in it is around learning the right words and the right time to use those words and phrases. You won't tend to fuss with it in Salesforce all the time. So typically, that any of you who set up SSO before, single sign-on, you'll know that you'll be probably doing that once every now and again, as opposed to doing it every single day. But guess what? You actually use and are exposed to these tools and the effect of these tools on a daily basis. Personally, when I'm logging into websites, I'm always looking in the bottom left-hand corner. My eyes always go to the bottom left-hand corner since I started learning this to watch all the browser relays and look at all the parameters that are going through. You think of all those long URLs that are full of a scrambled jumble up of letters and numbers. You're actually seeing token exchanges taking place right there in front of you.
And Gemma mentioned that that identity and access is really a loosely coupled bundle of tools in Salesforce and in other systems. It's not just a Salesforce thing. But in Salesforce, these are some of the tools that are part of identity and access management as a whole. When I first started learning about this, I was like, well, identities, you know, Identity Connect and external identity licenses and things like that. But as it turns out, there are different pieces of the platform that can be leveraged in single sign-on or OAuth, and they're all across the board. So even a thing, I'll take one example on the slide, a thing like App Launcher can be leveraged in an IDP-initiated single sign-on implementation, and we'll take a look at what that exactly means in a little bit. But you know, App Launcher, we all know that as a declarative tool, right? We build apps with the app builder and use App Launcher every day, but it's actually part of Salesforce Identity. So we're going to look at how all these different pieces, my domain, social sign-on, connected apps, all of these make up identity in Salesforce.
So let's break it down. We've done, as architects, one of the things we have, well, the primary thing we have to do, aside from setting things up, is actually being able to relate the features and tools that we use to a real life scenario, right? We're consultants at the end of the day. So we're going to present you with a couple of fictional organizations, starting with Insecure Systems Inc. Now, these users are really jumping up and down. They've got far too many systems, and believe me, this is actually happening in real life, okay? This was inspired by a real life situation, and you'd be absolutely gobsmacked if you knew what kinds of organizations are still stuck in this way of working. So Insecure Systems Inc., their users have far too many systems to use, but also they have to log into every single one individually. That means that they've got lots of passwords. Some of them are being reused, not very secure. They're actually writing them all down on Post-its and posting them all over their desks and their walls and so on. And they've had, not surprisingly, they've had 3 security breaches in the last year. And people who left absolutely years ago still have access to their systems. I'm sure that many of you have seen this in action and may be dealing with it even now. It takes 3 days for new joiners to get access to systems, and they've really got to pull their socks up and become Secure Systems Inc. So how can we help Secure Systems Inc? We can solve it with single sign-on. We give them one set of credentials. Woohoo! That single set of credentials means that they only have to log in once. It also means that IT, they have the ability to control all of the session expiries remotely. So if somebody leaves the company, they can expire their logins immediately instead of waiting, you know, or never doing it. With the automatic provisioning and deprovisioning of users, your new starters don't have to wait 3 days in order to get access to all the systems they need to use, which is going to save money in the longer run, and it's going to produce that. It's going to result in some increased productivity. It also means that, again, looking at users who have left, if you're automatically deprovisioning users, then you're less likely to have a security breach because you can switch them off straight away, or you can just enter a date, a leaving date in a field, and have their access be automatically deprovisioned. The way that this happens is that there's trust established between all the systems, and once you have that trust established between systems, it can scale. You produce one solution and you add people to it, and that automatically propagates the access that they need across all the individual systems. If you introduce another system, you can automatically propagate the people into that system. So it's far more scalable and results in huge reductions in help desk costs, because your IT support desk is then able to focus on supporting more serious issues like the security breaches that they've had to deal with for the last year, rather than resetting passwords and adjusting at people's access.
Absolutely. And this diagram on the right-hand side of the screen is one of my favorites. It's from, and it's credited in the slide notes, it is from a blog called The Beer Drinker's Guide to SAML. And I think it illustrates some of these terms that we've been throwing around pretty well. So I'll just recap them very quickly. So we've we've talked about single sign-on, that's SSO with single sign-on. We will talk about the term IDP, so that's identity provider. It stands for identity provider. And in the IT world, that could be something like Active Directory or Okta or Ping Federate. It's the system that holds it's the server that is responsible for validating the identity of your users. And then on the right-hand side of the diagram, you can see in the beer tent, that's our SP, our service provider, and that could be Salesforce or Gmail, any sort of application. And just very quickly to break down the trust thing, because I think that's so important. You know, single sign-on and SAML, and we'll get into SAML in a second, is all about trust. So in this case, the wristband station, right? If this beer festival, this fictional beer festival we're having, the wristband station is checking IDs of everyone that comes in. So Gemma comes in, she hands the wristband station her ID, and the wristband station now trusts that Gemma is over the legal drinking age. So they give her a wristband. So there's trust between the wristband station and Gemma. And then Gemma goes and she has her nice little wristband and goes to the beer tent. And the beer tent doesn't ask Gemma again for her ID because the beer tent trusts that the wristband station is doing its job. So the beer tent trusts the wristband station and the wristband station trusts Gemma. Therefore, the beer tent trusts Gemma. Okay, so that is our fictional. What did you say, Gemma?
Gemma trusts beer.
Gemma trusts beer. True. So let's talk about risks, because I think that funny story illustrated a good thing that maybe just got typed into the chat. So there is a single point of failure, right? And we're putting a lot of trust into our IDP or our wristband station. Because if our wristband station were to have maybe a corruption or someone who wasn't trained properly to not check the IDs, now that I'm not checking Gemma's ID anymore. So I need to make sure that my wristband station is like well-trained, is secure, has people that I trust it running it, all of that good stuff. So single point of failure is definitely a risk when we talk about single sign-on. It can be temperamental to set up. So just from a logistics point of view, you have to do different settings on both sides of the house. So back to the IT world, if I'm trying to set up single sign-on between Active Directory and Salesforce, there's settings and things that I need to do on both sides of the house. What else? If you're locked out, so if you forget in our fictional scenario, if you forget your ID, your driver's license, and you're going to the wristband station, you're not going to be able to get a wristband. And it doesn't matter how many beer tents there are in this festival, you're not going to be able to get beer from any of them because you don't have the credentials needed to get your nice little wristband. And the same thing goes with an IDP. If you get locked out of the IDP, you forget your credentials to Okta, for instance, you're not going to be able to get into any of your applications. So those are some risks. Like any good architectural consideration, there's always trade-offs and risks. And for those of you in the webinar who want, you're dying for that technical diagram or a little bit more of you don't care about beer and wristbands, you want to get to the nitty-gritty, we have a little bit of something for you as well. So we've I think overstated this, that single sign-on and SAML, so this is a new term, is all about trust. So we're throwing in SAML now for those who might not be familiar with what it is. It is an acronym. It stands for Security Assertion Markup Language, and it's the protocol that's used in single sign-on. So it's written for those of you who want the technical details. We're just going to hit on a little bit of it now. SAML is a little packet of information that's written in XML, and I'll walk you through how SAML is used in this diagram. So. We'll use a little bit of our wristband terminology so we don't lose the folks who may be learning this for the first time. So I'm my end user. I am trying to access, at the end of the day, I want to go into my Salesforce org, or I want to access the different beer tents that are available at this beer festival we're at. So I'm going to try to access Salesforce or go into the festival, and I'm going to get redirected with a SAML request to my identity provider, which in our beer festival is the wristband tent. In the real world, maybe it's Active Directory. I'm going to get prompted to log in if I need to, so I might get challenged for my credentials. Once I log in, or enter in my my password to Okta, say, or give my driver's license, my identity provider is then going to send what's called a SAML assertion or a SAML response back to my service provider, and it's going to say, hey, I checked Gemma's ID, I trust her. Here is the information that you need to go ahead and log her in, and it's going to provide some additional information. So if you're very curious about it, it's going to contain a couple pieces of information, like a digital signature, who issued it, and then Gemma's info, like her user ID and the entity ID. So it'll contain a lot of information so that the different beer tents, or Salesforce in this case, can trust Gemma and provide her access to her resources in Salesforce and also some beer. So that's single sign-on. Now let's get back into the scenarios, because I think architecturally we got the nitty-gritty, we got the scenario. Let's go on to our next identity and access challenge.
Okay, so our next challenge is this wonderful .org nonprofit called logyourselfin.org. They implemented a portal not long ago, and their problem is that customers aren't using it. Their constituents aren't using it. Their constituents customer satisfaction survey says that the sign up form is just too long, so it's putting people off. They're not wanting to log into the portal, and because they can't remember their username and password, IT seems to spend all day resetting passwords, and their customer support costs are through the roof because that's forming the majority of their questions. In addition to that, their volunteers trying to log into their portal complain about the wrong details are being kept for them, and that's resulting in them being sent or offered shifts that aren't even in their area. So how do we even go to solve this? Bearing in mind, in a non-profit situation, there's limited resource, limited time, and limited money. So with social sign-on, we actually are able to provide access to the portal for constituents and volunteers without needing to complete a registration form. And many of you will have seen this day to day. If you've ever tried to log in with Facebook or log in with Twitter or LinkedIn, you've used social sign-on. You've got no additional passwords to remember. And isn't it frustrating when they decommission one of those social networks, and you have to try and then reset it and set yourself a password or change providers? But it also means that there's an existing authentication framework that you can tap into, and that's really important for logyourselfin.org. They can't afford to go and get a server to act as an authentication server, so it costs them less. All they have to do is tap into the Facebook and LinkedIn APIs. The experience is also user-led. The user provides the name and the location of themselves. They provide their own email address, but also they provide the consent that's required in order to enable that login. So what are the risks, Susannah?
Yeah, what are the risks? So I'm always the downer. I'm the one to come in here and say, well, it's a great solution, but I do think that's an important role of an architect, right? You have to weigh those risks and trade-offs. So the risks for social sign-on. This one might seem obvious, but the user must have a social account, right? But from an architectural perspective, you have to figure out, how do you want to handle that then? Do you only want to set up social sign-on for a single social provider, like just Google, or should it be Google and Facebook, or do you want to also include Twitter? Because you'll have to sign up each and every one of those authentication providers. You also need, so this goes back to our original conversation, right? You need to be able to trust that this social provider is going to protect the user's data, because ultimately, if someone's using your service, you're using Facebook to provide the user's credentials, and there's a breach in Facebook, you know, you're delegating that sort of security concern to them. So is that something that you want to do? Does it make sense for your business? Also, there are some technical skills required when you're setting up this. There's actually two ways to set up social sign-on in Salesforce. Either setting up using an identity provider that's more of like the old school, more similar to like SAML and SOAP, so you use XML in that setup, versus the maybe newer, flashier way, which is, I don't know, I call it flashier, but OpenID Connect. It's more of a REST-based, similar to like OAuth. that we'll talk about in a little while. So depending on how you set it up, there's different pieces in Salesforce that you need to activate. And one of those, if you're using OpenID Connect, is a registration handler. And that's a little piece of Apex that tells the system how to handle the information coming in from the social provider and how to match it and do all that good stuff. And in sort of the same vein, you need to figure out how you're going to handle, number one, handle duplicates coming in, but also if I'm Gemma using Twitter and I have one email associated with Twitter and one handle, and then I'm also using Facebook, I might have a different email and a different handle. And so there's no way to tell that these two users that are logging in are the same Gemma, right? So finally, in B2B, so this is sort of the most important as an architect, the most important thing to take into account. So if you're using Salesforce in a B2B scenario, or maybe like a good example that I can think of off the top of my head is like a hospital, you're trying to connect with providers. You don't want to get, Dr. John Smith's, I don't know, Hotmail account. Like, you don't care about that. You want to get his account at Harvard Medical School or whatever it is. So if you don't have the right scenario, you might just completely eliminate social sign-on as an option. You could also use it for maybe a community. For instance, you might use social sign-on for your community, but use single sign-on for your internal users. So there's lots of ways to mix and match some of these tools too. And now this isn't so much of a technical diagram, but I think it illustrates an individual flow pretty well for folks who want to see how it all fits together. This is actually taken from a Trailhead module that I highly recommend about external identity and using social sign-on. So I'll walk you through this. So on the left side of the screen, you can see the user. The user is going to encounter a Salesforce login page, and this can be configured. So you might completely turn off the username and password entry and force them to use social sign-on. That's an option. But in our case, we have the option to do one or both. So the user is going to say, hey, I actually want to use Facebook to log into my Salesforce account. And they're going to click on the little icon down there and be redirected to Facebook to enter their Facebook credentials and log in. And once they've logged into Facebook, Facebook will automatically log the customer into Salesforce because Salesforce trusts Facebook's verification. And the way that Salesforce trusts Facebook's verification is because it's been set up ahead of time. Again, in all of these identity scenarios, there's like almost a mirrored setup that has to happen. You need to do some setup so that Facebook is logged in Salesforce as an authentication provider. One thing that's missed from this diagram and is sort of missed from the Trailhead is that registration, that Apex registration handler we mentioned, and that's going to need to be created to make sure we know how to update the user Salesforce account with the right information and create users, say, with a specific profile or different little attributes on the user record. Okay, so I think we'll dive into our next scenario.
Yeah, so we nicknamed Oauth Oawful, primarily because of how complicated it was for us to unpick it and get ourselves to a state where we could understand it before picking it back together again and starting to use some of the terminology. But when Charlie and Susannah and I started to study this, we established that OAuth is a principle of token exchange, which is handled by a client. And that client could be your desktop browser. It could also be an application, just like the data loader. Or it could even be an application that is held on your smart TV. If you've ever tried to connect Netflix or another streaming application through your TV, they use OAuth in order to swap tokens and enable you to log in. So I'm just going to very quickly go through the key concepts. We have authorization, which is consent. That's if you've ever tried to log in with Facebook and then you manage to successfully log in, and then the first thing you see is a screen that says, this application would like to access this information. You click allow. That's the authorization and consent side of things. We've talked about the authentication server. So this is where this is the server that validates that you are who you say you are and that you should have access access to this resource and that there is trust, or that it trusts you. The resource server is where the information that you're trying to access is held, and where the trust is established between with the authentication server. Your client, as I've said, is what you're using to access the information, and the grant type is a flavor of how OAuth will grant access to you. And there's not a lot of documentation around this in Salesforce help and training, but you will find it out there on the internet should you want to go and look. And then finally, we have the concept of a token. So we've talked about token exchange. A token is a scrambled, jumbled up code that enables you to access the resource for a certain amount of time. In Salesforce language, your access token is a session ID. Your refresh token is something that gets exchanged for a session ID. And a JOT token is a JSON web token, and it's used between two systems that explicitly trust each other in order to, and they use, it's used as a currency for a session ID as well. Now, there are multiple types of flows, as I've mentioned before. If you've ever connected MuleSoft, you'll use a web server flow. If you've ever connected the data loader to Salesforce, you use a user agent flow. And if you've ever connected BBC iPlayer, for those of you in the UK, where you have to, you click login, and then it shows you a code and then tells you to go and visit a URL on your phone and then type in the code, then you've used a device authentication flow. So why do we use OAuth?
Yes, great question.
Go for it.
Yeah. Okay, so giving Gemma a bit of a break, I think that OAuth is always such a heavy topic, right? There's so many different flows, there's so many different things going back and forth. But why even use it? Because it is, why don't I just have my user enter in a password? Like, why go to all this trouble? Well, there's a number of different advantages, but the ones that I will focus on, so there's a lot on the screen here, but the people used to describe OAuth as the valet key to a different set of systems. And now that we're not, going out into the world anymore, we're not driving, and we're definitely not using valet. Maybe it's lost a little bit of its meaning, but what folks mean when they say the valet key of different systems is that if you were to just give another system a credential, like a login credential, that system has access to everything that the user who has that credential has access to. So if Gemma's a system admin and she gave a credential to a different system, that credential would have access to everything that Gemma has access to. But with OAuth, you're able to provide little bits of permission, so what's called scopes. So maybe Gemma uses her credentials and authorizes a third-party application to have access to some of her Salesforce data. But she doesn't need to provide access to all of her Salesforce data. She can provide only access via the API, or only access to email, or only access to a very little specific part of her Salesforce information or Salesforce abilities, essentially. And so that's really important. I think the other advantage of using OAuth is the expiration. So if I were to share my username and password, unless I change my password or delete my account, that system is going to be able to access it whenever it wants. But with OAuth using tokens, this idea of using token exchange, these tokens expire, and there's lots of different policies that you can apply to the tokens as well, so that you have very fine-grained control of how long the system can have access to Gemma's data in Salesforce for. And then the last point I'll make around the advantages of OAuth is, if I decide as a user that I no longer want a system to have access to my credentials, then I have the ability to do that. I don't need to call up the system and ask them to do it. And I'll illustrate that by saying maybe you're using Facebook and you've authorized Farmville because you really want to play Farmville. You've used your Facebook credentials and you've authorized Farmville, and then you realize, hey, you know what? I've had it. I no longer want to play Farmville. I'm good. I can go ahead and revoke access to Farmville from my Facebook account. And I can see all the different applications that I've authorized to use my Facebook account and turn them off or only provide a certain scope. And just that type of access, again, fine-grained control that is under the control of me, the user, is the reason to use OAuth. So Gemma, I know we're running short on time. Do we want to try this?
I think what we can do is encourage you, because we are running very short on time, we can encourage you to come and watch this video on our YouTube channel. This is a session we did at Dreamforce last year, and thank you to everybody who, if you're on this call, thank you for doing this for us. We actually had people get together and act out an OAuth flow. It was a lot of fun, and we did this using the analogy of a child asking mum and dad for an ice cream. So if you've got a few moments and you want to check this video out, then do feel free to come to Ladies Be Architects YouTube channel and look under the Identity and Access Management playlist, and you'll see this video here. It's a lot of fun. We were going to show it, it's just a little bit, we're just running a bit short of time. So, and also here are some flows. So if you want to go and have a look at those in more detail and look at how all the different things that the browser does during these OAuth flows, then we encourage you to go and learn them off by heart, because you know they'll enrich your life. We just want to close with a couple more things. So Susannah, do you want to just talk to this one?
Absolutely. So, you know, we hit on some, maybe I would call them the big three, like the big three identity and access concepts, but there's so much more. There's also a lot of different flows. I saw some questions in the chat around, you know, well, what happens if you start at the IDP instead of the SP, or the other way around in our single sign-on illustration that we did. There's lots of different flows and nuance for all these different concepts, and also a lot more concepts. So we didn't hit on name credentials or like delegated authentication we didn't talk about, or certificates. We sort of assumed certificates in some of these scenarios, but didn't dive into them. But don't be disheartened. It can seem overwhelming, but once you can place these high level, like how would you use this? And then you start to think about like, oh, well, I use name credentials when I'm calling out to the system, but I use OAuth when I'm calling in a connected app, when I'm calling into the system. You can start to place these different concepts in this mental model that you've created. So it's, this is just the tip of the iceberg, but I think the more that you understand at a high level, instead of getting into the nuance when you're just starting to learn, will be helpful. What else, Gemma? Let's see. So maybe I'll kick it off. So, you know, this has definitely been this has been my, the part of learning about Salesforce architecture that has taken the most time for me. It was a new concept because I came up in the Salesforce ecosystem as an admin. So I didn't have some of this like knowledge outside of the Salesforce system. So it's definitely been a process of building up my identity confidence. I've found help in building it myself. So going through trailheads, going through some of the resources in the architect community. And then right now where I am, I'm still, you know, I think we're all still constantly learning. I'm definitely at a point right now where I feel like I need to go back and read the specs for like OAuth 2.0 and also OpenID Connect, but I definitely wouldn't have started there. So I know I gave some of you a heart attack when I pulled that up at the beginning of the session, but there's always these different layers of learning, and that's okay. I think it's part of the fun. Gemma, what's your advice?
Wow. The thing that made me feel better about learning all this stuff, because when I first opened up the documents and I was just like, oh my God, this is just horrible, is that actually it's just to remember that you are living it every day and that you're seeing it happen in action every day, and that the more you learn and the more experience you have building it yourself, the easier it's going to be to understand. And now you're at the point where I mean, like I say, every time I log into a website, Success Community is a good example, I am watching all the relays go on, and just through watching those relays, I figured out there are at least 3 systems that talk to each other to log you into the Success Community. And I couldn't have learnt that if I hadn't spent the time to try it out, to build it myself, but actually also to place some value on understanding the concepts outside of the technical terms. We've tried to act things out. We have used analogies. We have drawn pictures. And yes, some of the technical terminology has fallen out the bottom for sure. I need to go back and you know, just remind myself of that. And it has actually, you know, tripped me up during my CTA review board. I forgot some of the words as well, but I knew it in my head. And once you know it in your head and you've tried to do it, you've tried to to explain it, then you can kind of rebuild the technical terminology on top, and before you know it, you're reading through that documentation going, yeah, I know what that says. But what we just tried to break it down a bit in order to understand it better and relate it to real life.
Absolutely. And if you're interested in learning more, if you are just starting out on your identity and access management learning journey, there's lots of different resources. Sorry for the blue text. These are links to different resources. If you are just learning out or just starting out, I would recommend the second bullet. Definitely learn the language of identity. I think that's a good one to start with now that you've gone through and learned some of the higher concepts. Also, LBA has a wonderful YouTube channel with a lot of videos, including what I consider to be famous video of Charlie, our other co-lead who couldn't be here today. She explains OAuth and all the different flows in easy to understand language, and it is a wonderful video. I highly, highly recommend it. And there's again, lots of resources on Trailhead. There's an entire trail about identity and access management. So tons of resources. Anything else we missed? Any other resources you want to plug, Gemma, in our last 30 seconds?
I would like to share the link for the OAuth video. Not the Charlie one, the acting out of the OAuth video. But I can't figure out how to do it in the chat. I can only get access this one. Yeah, I can only get access to Q&A. So maybe our moderators can help ping that out to all of the
that
would be good
attendees. Yeah, cool. So I think just to wrap it up, I thank you everyone for joining us early in the morning, late in the evening. We really appreciate you.